prepare the book. So please know that some information that I give tonight may contain a wrong name or a really bizarre interpretation that I have of a handful of documents I've recently uncovered. So I'm open for critique, and if I mention anything that isn't correct or match your knowledge of the subject, please let me know. I will not be offended. So first of all, Great Escapes, Journeys on Maryland's Underground Railroad is a book which is scheduled to come out in November. And it will look at the history or unwritten history of the Underground Railroad in the state of Maryland and across the state. So all the counties in Maryland will be represented in the book, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, kind of my bona fides, I'm just going to give you a little background on the work I've done and how it's led up to this moment, talk about the book, and then go into some of the specific types of information that are going to be in the book, but with a focus on your region of the state. So, Mr. Kessler, you can advance to the first slide.
How do we do that? We click
either right.
There we go.
All right, so a little bit of background. Tony Cohen, I'm from Washington, D.C., was born in Washington, D.C., raised in Montgomery County, Maryland, and graduated in 1982 from Rockville High School in Rockville, Maryland. Took about a decade off of school, worked, traveled, got all that out of my system, and then returned to school as I think a 27-year-old to first the Corcoran School of Art, and then eventually American University. And while at American U, I was given a task for my history class. It was my senior paper, and I had to write about some aspect of American history that had gone unrecorded. So I chose the topic of the Underground Railroad, and I focused on Montgomery County, Maryland, as my kind of area of study. I knew that Maryland was a slave state. I knew that our northern border, the Mason-Dixon line, was the historic delineation between slavery and freedom. And I knew that my county sat about 40 miles south of that destination, and thought that certainly some kind of Underground Railroad history or activity may have been found there. The story of how I found the Underground Railroad is a 45-minute lecture, so you're not going to get it today. But basically, I used oral history, going through the community, interviewing people of all different backgrounds, some from the oldest families in our community, some from communities started by free Blacks and formerly enslaved people. And I use those oral histories as a way to find primary documentation. Lo and behold, 6 months later, I had documented 4 routes of escape through our county, 3 safe houses, and wrote my paper, got an A, graduated with a degree in American Studies, and then faced a mystery greater than that of the Underground Railroad, which is, what do you do with an American Studies degree? So a few months later, the Montgomery County Historical Society, someone there read my paper, suggested that we get a grant, publish it as a book, and that's what you're seeing there. Great Escapes is going to be an expansion of that original Montgomery County book statewide. Next, please.
Why isn't that working?
Yeah, you can do so you can do the right arrow, down arrow, or some strange mouse click.
Okay.
Which I haven't figured out yet. Excellent. So, oh yeah, go back one. There we go. So after publishing the booklet, about a year after that, while I was between jobs, I got this idea that I needed a nice long vacation, and I took that in the form of a project. I decided to retrace or walk one of the routes of the Underground Railroad out of my county that I documented, traveling north to see where it would lead me. So I embarked from Sandy Spring, Maryland in May of 1996, 25 years ago, and traveled through Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, eventually crossing the Niagara into Canada after 8 weeks. Again, another 45-minute presentation, not tonight, but you can see in the top left corner, a younger, spelter looking me from 1996. Next to that, an image of Henry Box Brown, an enslaved man from Richmond, Virginia, who shipped himself to the North. So during one of my, one portion of my walk, I was put inside of a wooden crate, smuggled on an Amtrak train, and shipped from Philly to New York without anybody knowing. Smithsonian magazine followed me on the last 10 days of my walk. Oprah read it. She had me on her show. And then she told me that she had just bought the rights to Toni Morrison's Beloved, and wanted some kind of experience like mine to inform her role. So 6 months later, before she went into production on the film, I brought her to an old Maryland plantation here in my county, blindfolded her, transported her to the site, and we recreated the year 1850 on this plantation. We brought in living history reenactors who portrayed the people of the past. I got a guy from Frostburg to come down with his bloodhounds to hunt her down in the woods at night. That was fun. All sorts of things. We just kind of threw the historical kitchen sink at her, and it really helped her in her role. Another 45-minute presentation at another time. In 1998, I did a second journey from Alabama to Canada, and you can see me holding the Canadian flag there. Next, please. As a result of my association with Oprah and interest that that gained, I decided to form a nonprofit in 1999 called the Menaire Foundation, and actually set up our nonprofit on an old farm so that we could teach history by putting history in people's hands. So at Button Farm, we do a variety of activities that we loosely call the Underground Railroad Immersion Experience. And it's everything from growing 19th century crops that were grown in our county that we've researched. We raise heritage breed animals that were in our county at the time. We have tools and agricultural implements at the time. You know, the kids come out, they get off the bus, we put hose in their hands and we put them in the fields working. And then from their second person interpretive experience, we have the Socratic method of discussion, and they tell us what the nature of plantation life must have been like. Another 45-minute presentation. That's me giving a speech. We also, at the Menaire Foundation, we run a sub-company called Chesapeake Tours, which is a heritage tour company. We do the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway on the Eastern Shore. And hopefully beginning next year, we'll start exploring some kind of Douglas related tour in your neighborhood. Next, please. All right, so the Underground Railroad. So I'm just going to take you through a bunch of slides that have elements of what is going to be captured in the book. As many of you probably know, the Underground Railroad was a loosely to highly organized system of escape and of forwarding people from the South to the free states of the North. If you were enslaved in Texas, you weren't going to Canada. You'd go south into Mexico. If you were in Spanish Florida, you could go to the Caribbean. If you were on the East Coast, you could stow away aboard a ship and get to England or even back to Africa in some cases. So it was anywhere where a system of forwarding existed. It was mainly operated by people opposed to the system of slavery, though some of the most effective people on the Underground Railroad did their work for pay. Despite this history, in the 20th century, the Underground Railroad went largely overlooked by historians of American slavery. They thought it was an anecdotal topic, and that because of its secretive nature, there were no records. But they were wrong. And we know more about the Underground Railroad now than probably a century ago. Two people who are key to our understanding of the Underground Railroad today are the two gentlemen you see. And this is contemporary research to the time of the Underground Railroad, just after emancipation. The gentleman on the left is a man named William Still, and he was a member of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, Anti-Slavery League. For 10 years, from about 1850 to about 1861, he operated a station of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. And it was the main hub of underground activity on the East Coast. Bucking conventional wisdom, he kept a detailed record of every person who traveled through his station. Over 900 people in a 10-year period he documented. And everyone who came in, he would interview them, ask them their name. He would write down if they were traveling under their real name or an alias, where they had come from, who they had left behind, what prompted them to quit slavery and strike out for freedom. And he would include as much biographical information about their owners or their professed owners, the people who claimed them. And his motivation was he believed slavery would perish one day and that people would come north and go south, trying to reunite with families. So he wanted a record of people who went through him so it could make it easier for reunification. In 1871, he published his book. You can just Google it online. It's William Still's Underground Railroad. You can get a free copy from Project Gutenberg or something. And it's full of people who escaped from the Eastern Shore. I should have done a numbers count for Talbot, Queen Anne, and Caroline County. I forgot to do that, but I'd say a good quarter, if not 40% of all the people listed came from your region. To the right is a man named Wilbur Siebert. He was a professor of European history at Ohio State University. And around 1892, he started trying to engage his students. The story that I've read is that he was in his class one day and the students were all nodding off because it was a boring history, whatever. And so he said, all right, who here has heard of the Underground Railroad? And hands started going up. And he's like, great, I want you to go to your family, your friends, your neighbors, and collect their stories. So it was oral history. He didn't call it that, but that's what it was. And he continued to do this for 6 years. In 1898, he published his first book called The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom. And it was the first real comprehensive look at the railroad, how it operated. His area of focus was, of course, mainly in Ohio, but he got correspondence from all over the country and published this book. He continued to research the topic for another 40 years, I believe until 1952, when he died. I think he was at Harvard at that time. And so Ohio Historical Society has 72 volumes of his correspondence with people who are still alive, their children, whatnot. Unfortunately, there's only one volume for what he referred to as the Southern States. But he had a first-hand interview with Harriet Tubman. He's got some really good stuff in there, and he produced some of the first maps. You can see one under his picture of the main routes, trunk lines, whatnot, of Underground Railroad activity. And if you Google Siebert map, it'll pop up on the internet. Next, please. So historians continue to believe that you really couldn't document the Underground Railroad until the internet came around. And especially in the last 15 to 20 years, as archives have started digitizing, putting their information out, we know gobs more about the system and how it worked. If you look down in the lower right corner, there is a copy of what were known as slave narratives. These were biographies or autobiographies written by or about fugitives once they had reached freedom, telling their life story, and they're often used to bolster the abolitionist movement. You all have probably the greatest or most influential slave narrative of all time, which is that of Frederick Douglass. All however many versions, what was it, 5 versions or something, he kept updating it. But some amazing resources have come up in the ensuing years. There's an amazing website from University of North Carolina called Documenting the American South, where they have digitized every book in their collection by or about a Southern author. So it's got an amazing search engine. So you can put in escape, Talbot, and any document that has those words in it will furnish a source. The National Park Service for the past 20 years has run what they call the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. It seeks to document Underground Railroad sites and programs. Above that is a source that is just absolutely indispensable. The Maryland State Archives has created a website called The Legacy of Slavery. And for the past 15 years, they've been digitizing any reference to slavery that's in their collections. So you can actually go to one of their links called Beneath the Underground Railroad, and it has everything from accommodations records, assessment, certificates of freedom, listings of deserters during the Civil War, slave auction information, inventories, manumissions, pardon records for people who were tried and convicted of aiding in escapes, which are also included in penitentiary records, runaway slave ads, slave jails, slave schedules, and slave statistics. So check out that site. I'll be referencing some of the things that I found there related to your region. Next, please. Oh, and I just forgot to mention Ancestry is also a powerful database. Can talk about that later. So also in the book, it'll touch on the history of the Underground Railroad statewide, but it will also include kind of sidebars and case studies for each region of the state. And those are going to pair with the heritage regions. So, we're going to tie the history to existing and accessible interpretations of this period as a way of expanding everybody's mission. Next, please. And one of the things that the book will also include is tours. So after reading yourself to death about the history, you can get in your car and you can either go on existing tours, such as the Frederick Douglass tour, or to destinations such as Atkins Arboretum's Nature in the Underground Railroad, A Journey Begins, which I was a consultant on. Very good. You should absolutely do that. And for regions that don't have tours, we'll be creating tours. So, people can get on the road and see what's there. Next, please. All right. So I'm going to get through these as quickly as I can, leave time for Q&A. But these are just some elements of the type of research that we're going to be looking at, and certain types of documents that you can pursue for research in your area. So the slave trade was, critical to the story of the Underground Railroad. William Still claims that fear of sale, threat of being sold at the auction block, prompted most of the people who went through his station. He said, fear of family breakups is what prompted people to run more often than anything else. You have, for instance, this one ad, which is from Somerset County, and it's for slave trading firm Overley and Sanders. Even though Somerset is a nice distance away from you, you'll notice that this firm has offices in Princess Anne, Cambridge, and Easton. So slave trading firms were networks of their own. So instead of an underground railroad to freedom, it was frequently an underground railroad to the Deep South. People like Patty Cannon on the Eastern Shore, who were kidnappers, would also kind of overlap the northbound and the reverse Underground Railroad. To the right, you'll see a ship's manifest, and I didn't have time to find one that related to the Eastern Shore, but Congress officially ended the African slave trade in 1807, 1808, and then a domestic trade began. So really, as tobacco culture waned in the Chesapeake region and the Louisiana Purchase was made, enslaved people were sold south to the Deep South to work on sugar and rice and plantations. So there was a domestic Middle Passage. And to make sure that ships coming into ports were not bringing Africans, they had to carry a manifest. And the manifest said the name of the ship, which port it originated at, which ports it had stopped at, and the names of the people on board, and who, which auction houses or which owners sometimes were transporting them. So if you look at that one page, every name with given name and surname is the name of an enslaved person. Enslaved people in Maryland, to probably the 90th percentile, had full names. So if you can, trace sales to your area, this gives you a good sense of who was being sold and where they were ending up. Next, please. All right, so here we go. And again, some information I have in here was kind of easy to find. Some is a little more general, but it just gives you a flavor. So kind of alongside of the Underground Railroad movement was the colonization movement. And that was a scheme that mainly started in the early 18 teens to repatriate enslaved people with the motherland in Africa. There was an American Colonization Society, there was a Maryland Colonization Society. Many people believed, slaveholders among them, that slavery would eventually die out. And what good would it be to have the land populated with free Blacks? So to repatriate them with Africa was the goal. Problem is, by the time of colonization, Africans or people of African descent were second, third, sometimes fourth generation American. They didn't go to Africa on vacations. Some of them couldn't even point to it on a map. Most of them have never even seen a map. So colonization died by its own weight. However, there were some key people. The man to the left is John H.B. Latrobe, son of the famous artist and architect Benjamin Latrobe. His resume is crazy long, but he was one of the founders of the American Colonization Society. And there is correspondence between him and Black people who went to Liberia from Queen Anne's County and Talbot and whatnot. John Brown Russwurm, to the right, was born in Jamaica. He published, he eventually moved to the United States. I think he was in Maine, and he published the first Black published newspaper called Freedom's Journal. In the 1850s, he became governor of a place called Maryland in Liberia, or Maryland County, Liberia. And he was the governor there. In the records of the state archives, I believe the number of people, let's see, is it here? Yes, 14 from Talbot and 10 from Queen Anne are recorded as having migrated to Liberia, and those are the surnames of some of the families. Certainly, other people were left behind, so some of those names might be familiar to you today. Just using two examples, Thomas Brown was one of those people who left from Queen Anne's County and moved to Harper, Liberia, I believe. He was there for a number of years, established himself, and then wrote to the Colonization Society. He might have been the person who wrote to Latrobe and got permission to come back to convince family members or people from his community to go to Africa. He went back empty-handed. Then you have a woman, Amy Parker, who was born free in Queen Anne's County, and she moved with her parents and sisters to Liberia. They had been there for several years near Cape Palmas, and then they died in a massacre with indigenous Africans over a land dispute. So I think they purchased land, and the people who had been there for millennia were like, wait a minute, that's our land. So sound familiar? Yep, same story, different place. So that didn't quite work out well for them. The capital of the Maryland colony was Harper, and it was named after Robert Goodloe Harper, who was a Maryland senator and one of the Colonization Society's founder. And as you see, there's Black Harper here too. So further research may show that some of the enslaved people who went to Africa were freed by colonization society members. More research. Next, please. All right, just a little sampling of Eastern Shore abolitionists of note. Samuel Ringgold Ward, who was a minister and an abolitionist in the North, born around 1817, somewhere on Maryland's Eastern Shore. The name Ringgold and the name Ward, I believe, are common to Queen Anne's County and also Kent County. So there may be a connection there. Harriet Tubman needs no introduction. Neither does your guy, Frederick Douglass. At the bottom is the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, who was born in Kent County in 1815. He escaped with his family as a child to New Jersey, later becoming an abolitionist, I believe a congregational minister, and then he was involved in some utopian schemes. He set up a colony for free Blacks in Jamaica, and then spent the remaining years of his life in Liberia. Next, please. Oh, I'm sorry. And Thomas Garrett of Wilmington, Delaware, ran the main station there, claimed to have sheltered over 2,300 freedom seekers during his tenure, and Harriet Tubman was one of his regular customers. And then we have Samuel Green, who was a friend of Harriet Tubman, ran the Underground Railroad with her in Dorchester and Caroline counties. He was arrested and sent to to state penitentiary, I think in 1857, for possessing a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was ruled to be an incendiary book. So he went to jail. I think he was pardoned after a few years. Next, please. All right, so now we get to the fun stuff. Let's see here. So one of the things I did use the Legacy of Slavery database from the state archives. And I just popped in the words Wye Mill, which is also Wye Mills. Sometimes it appears that way. And a number of things came up. I'm just including these two gentlemen. One is Joseph Callahan. Speak up if any of you are related to anybody in this PowerPoint. I'd like to know. We can do some more research together. Callahan, and I believe there's still Callahans around, listed his residence as near Wye Mills or Wye District. He owned a property called Noble Meadows or Clover Hill, which may be confused or a misspelling. In 1840, he had 8 slaves, died in 1844 without a will, and you can see a family, mother and her 4 sons, escape him on the left. $500 reward. That is a heavy, heavy, heavy reward, which means he had a fair amount of money. On the right are 2 ads from a man named William Henry DeCourcy, who died in 1848. One of these ads you can see is from him, and then one is signed estate of. It's only speculation, but one of these, the one that says estate of, is from 1851. So, you know, just within a couple of years of his death, enslaved people were escaping probably from his children. The pending death of a master, the breakup of an estate was often the reason that enslaved families were put in peril and then decided to escape. In one ad, he mentioned someone named John Linger. In another, he mentioned someone named Bill Singer. Singer and Linger might be the same surname, but some people had bad writing, so they sent these ads to the newspaper, and the newspaper was like, "It's an L, it's an S, who knows? Here we go." Next, please. And landmarks. So, down at the bottom, we have the courthouse in Easton. These are major repositories for the Underground Railroad. In a courthouse, you have wills and land records where the names of enslaved people are spelled out. And so it's a great way of figuring out who owned whom and at what time. Names also come up when those estates are divided amongst family members. When an estate was divided, people were sold off to pay the debts first. And if they survived that, then they got divided up amongst the heirs. Courthouses are where they recorded manumissions, which were the legal releasing of people from service. Some of the sales ads that you can find on Legacy of Slavery say from the courthouse door, and then it lists the people who are to be sold. So in your area, it was pretty clear, pretty cut and dry. The documentation of enslaved people was not hidden. In other places, sometimes you don't even find records of courthouse sales, even though they happen. And then sometimes people were sold to pay debts. Sometimes their owner's debts, sometimes their own. I'm not sure. I didn't do the research yet, but I don't know if the jail in Easton was located in the vicinity of the courthouse, but that is a kind of stopping point for many fugitives who are unfortunately captured on the road. We can talk more about that later. To the right of that, we have Third Haven meeting. In your region, there were no fewer than half a dozen Quaker meetings. I believe probably most of them fell under the Philadelphia meeting. Most of Maryland's fell under Philadelphia meeting, which by the time of the Revolutionary War, Quakers were questioning, in the face of their own calls for liberty, their holding of people in bondage. And so for the next quarter century, people were being read out of meeting if they continued the practice. We see some of that. Fortunately, Third Haven's records are fantastic. They've been digitized and they're on Ancestry, so you can fall into the rabbit hole there. I surveyed just a little bit. And so here's what I've pieced together. Forgive me if any of this is wrong. In this period of time, a lot of people did not have a lot of imagination when it came to naming practices. So they named their kids after their father, and there was sometimes 10 generations of individuals with the same name. I believe the three Hopkins in question are the Hopkins associated with the mill. One is our Quaker friend Samuel B. Hopkins. He was a member of Third Haven meeting. In 1840, however, there was a Samuel B. Hopkins of District 1. He has 10 white people enumerated, 2 free black and 2 enslaved. 9 of the people enumerated were involved in manufacturing. So makes me think that might be our guy. His brother, Thomas Hopkins, who at one time owned the mill in 1841, has no enslaved people. He was a member of Third Haven, I believe. Strangely, in 1850, he has 9 enslaved people. Then Samuel's son, John Richard Hopkins, is kind of interesting. I'm not sure if he was ever a formal member of Third Haven, but his wife, Emily Bowers Hopkins, appears to be. This Hopkins, John Richardson Hopkins, is buried in the Hopkins burial ground and not at Third Haven. Samuel is allegedly buried at Third Haven, but I don't believe there's a marker for him there. But the interesting thing is John Richardson Hopkins owned 4 enslaved people in 1850. His neighbor, your friend and mine, Edward Lloyd, in the same year owned 355 people. What was he thinking? Really? What are you going to do with that? Take over the world? Incredible. Probably the biggest slaveholder in the state in that year. Just astounding. Right in your backyard. In 1860, however, John Richardson Hopkins drops down to 1 enslaved person. What's telling here, or leaning here, is his wife, Emily Bowers Hopkins, dies in 1886, and her death is listed in the minutes of Third Haven, meaning, or likely meaning, that she was still an active Quaker participant. I could not find John Richardson Hopkins' death mentioned in Third Haven. Emily, however, is buried with her husband in the Hopkins family cemetery. So I believe that the family came from a long lineage of friends, but some of them kind of fell off the wagon, may have disassociated themselves, or may have been read out of meeting. Something for someone to really dig down, but the records are there, so it's just putting the time and energy into it. And then we have Cloverfields. Cloverfield or Fields was the seat of the Hemsleys of both Talbot and Anne Arundel. So they had land on both sides of the bay. This is probably pretty promising, but I was just not able to have enough time to dive into it. Among manumissions on the Legacy of Slavery website, 24 manumitted people have the name Hemsley associated with them, either as the people who are manumitting the enslaved person or the surname of the enslaved person. And when it's the surname of the enslaved person, it's someone living in Anne Arundel County or in Queen Anne's County. So there's an apple, there's a tree, fertile research for someone to do. It also begs the question of large slaveholders. How do we get large numbers of manumissions? This could be at the behest of someone's will. This could be as the result of a change of mind. I'm trying to remember her name, Anna Maria Hemsley, somebody who was living in Philadelphia in the 18 teens, was manumitting a bunch of people in Queen Anne's County. So, you know, perhaps there was migration, perhaps there was a change of mind, who knows? But, and then we have in Queen Anne's County alone, 32 people with the name Hemsley associated with them who possess certificates of freedom. So that was your free papers. So again, you could double check those two record groups just to get a sense of what was happening. Also Cloverfield appears as though it may have been owned by Samuel Hopkins at one time. I'm sure someone there knows. All right, next, please. All right, so the one thing I didn't find for Wye was an account of any enslaved person escaping from the mill, but certainly from your neighbors. I would, you know, just do more research around the large planters who are around the mill. But in general, for the book, it will contain the historical context, statistics, slave narratives, everything you see on that list. The images that I've used are of actually your neighbors in Caroline County who have really drilled down on the story of the Underground Railroad and are interpreting in very interesting ways. The picture in the middle is of the Jacob and Hannah Leverton house near Preston. It is the only documented Underground Railroad safe house still standing on the Eastern Shore. I am positive that we can find more. It's just going to take some work. There are in the in the pardon records, the pardons of a number of people. You should look at those cases. You may recognize a name of people who were sent to jail for harboring or helping people escape. And so new names of abolitionists, if you will, are there that are just kind of being overlooked in their role in the movement. Also in that picture is a house from a farm. The house is now called the Still family home, and it's believed to be a slavery era dwelling from the same farm that William Still's parents escaped from in the 18 teens. And so Caroline County saved it, and they've created a park around it. And below that is a picture of the Webb cabin, which is also, I believe, near Hurlock is the closest location. Free Black family lived there, and it's interpreted and also has its potato hole. Next, please. Oh my gosh, we're almost to the end. Yes, sources. Next, please. Great Escapes, Journeys on Maryland's Underground Railroad. Projected release date is Emancipation Day, November 1st, 2021. And we will let Barry know as the book gets closer. We're hoping to do some good promotions, and would love to get involved with you all I'm sorry, there is a stink bug dive bombing me. Um, Want to open it up for questions?
There we go. Yes.
Tony?
Let's,
Harmony, thank you.
go ahead. Is that John?
I didn't go in the chat, but I had something. I noted, because I worked for the telephone company, I guess, for 39 years. I noted under Overly and Sanders, it was interesting in their ad. It said, "Give us a call before you sell." That's August. It was hard for me to read. It was 1810 or 1840. I thought that was interesting, that terminology, "give us a call."
And I think it's 1840, yes.
Also, when you mentioned
Thank you, Nicole.
slaves, the Hemsleys, how many slaves did you say? 30?
Yeah, so that would be for
Just the house.
manumission records. Yeah.
Okay.
Over 30 people who had the Hemsley name, either Hemsley's freeing them or them being Queen Anne County people who were being freed and their names happened to be Hemsley.
All right. And you had mentioned Hemsley in Philadelphia. Today, one of the Hemsley family members, I think her name is Catherine, she lives up in Philadelphia, and she comes to the mill several times a year.
Well. It would be very interesting to, and does she know her family's connection with the mill?
Well, I think if you, through Barry, give me some information, I will connect you with somebody at Cloverfields, because that's being restored.
Yes.
It's almost done.
Nice.
A friend of mine is the general overseer of the work. It's being done by Cloverfield Preservation Foundation, Steve Hensley in Minnesota.
Nice.
He's running it. And as far as I know, Tony, there's only 3 families that ever owned that house. Hemsley's, a relative of Hemsley's, last name Foreman. Foreman sold to Callahan. And you mentioned a Callahan that said Clover Hills.
Yeah.
So anyway, there are just 3 things I wanted to do. But if you
Thank
give
you.
your information, if Barry, with your permission, gives me information, I can put you in contact, if you want, with the Hemsley family, the Cloverfield Preservation Foundation by the Hemsley. That's what I'm trying to say.
That would be fantastic. And maybe I can slide by them some of the, I don't want to call it weirder stuff, but something I came across said that Samuel Hopkins purchased, I guess for a short time, Cloverfields. One of the problems is sometimes records are referring to the name of the land grant, but not the house on it.
Right.
And so I'm guessing Cloverfields could be the name of, a patent name or a land grant name to which a house was put on. So if someone purchases, 100 acres of Cloverfield, it might not be that they're actually living at the house. So something like that probably is what's afoot.
The Cloverfield Preservation Foundation also owns what we call locally in Wye Mills, the Miller's House.
Oh,
which
okay.
was supposedly built by one of the Hemsleys, and Hopkins owned that house for quite some time. So that was part of Cloverfield.
Wonderful. Okay. Yep, that might be what the reference is to. Cool.
And
Following up
probably
on
know,
that,
I'll give up. I'll shut up.
That's okay.
Get
Who's
whoever was
next? And by the
talking,
way,
go ahead.
Barry, if you can if you can oversee the chat and just,
Yes. There aren't any questions in the chat, but I encourage anyone who has a question to type
Yeah,
it in the chat.
I think Ellen.
I am
Ellen
Thank you.
monitoring. Ellen, did
Yeah,
you?
Trying to
ask a
follow
question?
up on, yeah, no, I was trying to follow up on what John said. You were speaking of the Hopkins Cemetery. There is a cemetery behind what we call the Miller's house, owned by
Okay.
Hopkins. Is that the cemetery, or do you know where the Hopkins Cemetery is?
Yes, I believe that's the cemetery.
Okay.
I know in some records, the location of it, like I think from 1860 onward, is referred to as Skipton instead
Oh,
of
okay.
Wye Mills.
Oh, I'll have to look into it. That's interesting. Skipton is probably about 7 miles from Wye Mills. It is another town.
Yeah, which
Maybe
was
not that far.
also interesting because some documents, I guess, refer to the post office at Wye Mills. And then I think on one of the census records, maybe 1860, the location of the Hemsleys, if I'm remembering, was Skipton Post Office. So
Okay.
we all
That
know
could
how
have
the
been.
post office thing works. Your post office could be in another state from you, so
Correct.
could be a strange colloquial thing.
If I can add one more thing, you had the map that showed that so many escapes happened through Ohio. Are you familiar with Tracy Chevalier's book, The Last Refugee?
No.
I don't. It's an interesting read. I didn't realize I'm from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I thought, I see that as being the hub of the Underground Railroad. I was just interested in that book because it did deal with, it was a Quaker, it's a fiction, story of a Quaker who comes to Ohio and gets involved with the Underground Railroad there.
Very
So I was just curious
interesting.
if you knew the book. It's a good read. It's a girl's book.
Cool. I'll have to check it out. One of the things probably most important to dispel, the monolithic, the singular Underground Railroad is really a term that's best for us to describe a movement. The Underground Railroad on the ground was dozens, if not hundreds, of underground routes. So these routes were linked together by community affiliation, some by families that were stretched out over the landscape, some by religious denomination. Some, like Harriet Tubman's, were very interesting because they crossed religious denominations and they were multicultural, if I'm allowed to apply that term, to a century and a half ago. So some lines were very mixed. But every route of the Underground Railroad should probably be viewed as its own Underground Railroad. So if you were coming out of Western Virginia, then that's going to be the path to Ohio. If you were coming out of, this side of the mountains, it was going to be Pennsylvania. If you, depending on where you were on the Eastern Shore, you cross the Mason-Dixon line, but from Maryland into Delaware, which was also a slave state. So you're not quite free yet, but every region had its own unique configuration.
Tony, I have 2 questions that came up in the chat, and I'm going to give you both of them, and then you can take them as you wish.
Sure.
One of them is, were quilts used as signposts or as messages or in form of communication? It's one question. And the other question is, what is the range of different kinds of places that were used as hiding places. And to that, I want to add my question: are there any documented examples of a mill ever having been used as a station or a stop or a place on the Underground Railroad that is known or that you know?
Okay, so the last question is, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I do know for a fact that a number of Pennsylvania Quakers operated mills who were on the Underground Railroad. I believe Thomas Garrett may have even had a mill. I know at one time he had a shoe factory, but I'm not sure what that looked like or where it was. I can tell you that in Pennsylvania, not far from Philadelphia, is oh, what's it called? It's a forge. Hopewell Furnace was an active stop on the Underground Railroad, and freedom seekers coming across the Pennsylvania line and going a day or two could stop at the forge, work, doing forge work, some of which they had done back, below the Mason-Dixon line. But for instance, that operation paid daily. So at the end of the workday, you got paid a day's work, meaning that you were all paid up if you needed to skedaddle out of there and get to somewhere else quickly. So I would imagine that anyone escaping who had a miller's background or milling background would have logically sought work in a mill. I know one story, I can't even tell you where it's from, of freedom seekers coming out of, I think it was Harford County or maybe Cecil, and following streams into southern Pennsylvania. And they were told to follow the smell of the apples because there was a mill that processed apples or something, and you could smell it. This is just a story I heard once. So I'll keep my mind on mills. There should definitely be something. Quilts are a no. Raymond Dobard and Jacqueline Tobin, who wrote the quilt code, what is it called? Hidden in Plain Sight. Raymond was actually a friend of mine. I think he wrote an amazing book, but his chief informant, who said that this quilt code had been passed down through her family, eventually recanted her story after the book was, on the New York Times bestseller list for X number of weeks. Certainly, there were signs and symbols in the North. Sure, a quilt could have hung over, a fence or a clothesline as a signal, in the same way as a light in the window, or in some places in Massachusetts, some towns had painted black bands around the chimney stacks. That was supposed to be a symbol. But to use them as maps, starting from the plantation, is just highly unfeasible. And in the records of escapes, every method that was used has been accounted for and reported by at least two sources. Like, we know the North Star was used because it's mentioned in many slave narratives. We know that open roads were used, no hiding behind the bush. You travel at night, you travel on the open road, you're going to get to your destination quicker. No one, there has not been one firsthand or secondhand account of a man or woman escaping on the Underground Railroad with a quilt. So we just have to look at the some of the evidence. What was that last question? There was a third question.
Nope, I think the second question was, what is the range of different types of places that were used as hiding spots?
Fields, outbuildings, slaves coming out of Washington and passing through Prince George's County on one route in the 1830s were hidden in hollowed out corn shocks along the side of the road. Church belfries, spaces under houses that were set on blocks off the ground, in the holds of ships, in false bottom wagons, in crates or barrels that were put on trains or on boats. Yeah.
Just about any place somebody could be.
Yes.
We have another question, and that is from Audrey Forer.
Hello.
It's actually Steve and Audrey.
Steve, okay. Very
Tony,
good.
I just want to say it's good to see you again. Audrey and I saw you speak 20 odd years ago at Sandy Spring Museum.
Oh, wow.
We have since moved from Sandy Spring here to Eastern Shore. So it's like both of us, by the way, didn't have gray beards at that time.
That's right.
but here's my question. It's real simple. It's really about the census. I know in 1790 there was a slave census, and you mentioned census data, and I'm curious about other slave census events and whether the regular census was picking up slavery at that point and how far that continued. Thank you.
Sure. So like in the 1790 census, maybe the 1810 census, all the way to the 1840 census, those census records listed free male heads of household. And then everybody else is a number, right? Once you get to the 1850 census, there is a separate federal census, 1850 and 1860, called the slave census. And so you have the names of slaveholders and all of their human property enumerated, just enumerated by age, gender, whatnot. Though I will say there was a woman here in Montgomery County who in 1850, I don't know how or why, she made, I'm assuming, because she was the only one I could ever find, the census taker write down the first names of all the enslaved people on her property. I suspect it's because the year before her father died, and for the next 2 years, the estate was being fought over. So I think she probably wanted a clear record of who was there. We are thankful to her for that, because we actually know who the people are, and they can be traced. The other place where slave names come up is in the state of Maryland, at least, is in tax records during the 1850s. So there was a period of time where slaves were taxed. So they would come around 1851, 52, 53, on an annual basis, enumerate the name of the person, what their age value was. And then in 1864, when Maryland changed its constitution to abolish slavery, there was a notion that slaveholders might receive compensation for their loss. So by 1867, a formal census was done of slaveholders who listed the names of all the people who they had formerly claimed as property. The interesting thing about that is, to the 90th percentile, those people named had surnames. And 90%, I'm guessing, of those people with surnames had surnames different from their owners. You will see in runaway slave ads, owners say, escaped from, my farm in Talbot County, my Negro man, Bob, calls himself Robert Smith. Well, he's probably Robert Smith, and thank you for the information. It's exactly what we needed to know. So you can find names kind of, bubbling up everywhere. And then also in those shipping, intercoastal shipping documents. If you're in the deeper South, there was a fantastic record group at National Archives in DC that I was using in the 90s that's now at College Park. And it's the Confederate slave, what they call Confederate slave payroll records. Not meaning that slaves were paid, but during the war, they would impress into service the enslaved people of Southerners, and they would pay them or keep track of what they had earned. So, like my great grandfather on one line, Willis Braswell, who lived in Georgia, I found him working in a Confederate munitions factory in Macon. And it shows his name, and it shows what he was earning that was paid to his owner for his time. So there's all sorts of these little records that are hiding out there. It's just digging in, getting familiar with them, and then connecting the dots.
Those tax records from the 1850s, the Maryland State Tax Record, the annual taxes, where would those be hiding?
They're kind of hiding in plain sight now because the answer is the state archives.
Is the archives, okay.
And the archives has done just that amazing job with the legacy of slavery. So they
Right.
put a lot of that information online. So you just go to a legacy of slavery, click on something called database, and then you can search under the type of record. You can search by county. They're constantly adding to it, but you should be able, and it's assessments, tax assessments is what the title is.
Thank you.
Sure.
Wonderful. Well, we have had some very, very interesting learning go on this evening. Tony, thank you so much. I think we're going to wrap up because it is on the late side here. If those of you who are Old Wye Mill board members want to, and volunteers would like to stick around for about 5 or 10 minutes after our
You're going to make them have a board meeting?
yeah, after every speaker we have a little
Speak of Taskmaster. Wow.
a little wrap up.
Really, Barry. Okay.
Just keeping them awake. But Tony, thank you very much on
Thanks,
behalf of
everyone.
everyone. It's been great. And
Thanks for letting me speak.
we really appreciate hearing what you had to say.
Thanks, Tony.
Hope it was of value.
Yes, good night.
Good night.
So I have Larry, NIA, and Angela are people I do not know. Would any of you be willing to unmute or turn on your cameras? Hello?
Hi, actually, I meant to leave. I am interested in doing some work with you guys, but I didn't hit the leave fast enough tonight. So,
That's okay. Where do you live, Angela?
I live in Queenstown, actually.
Okay,
So-
so you are local.
I am
And have you been
local.
to before?
I've been to the mill several times. I buy flour there, and I actually have an odd connection to the mill. My great grandmother was married. Her second husband was the brother of the Milner in the early part of the century, I guess. So
Cool. That's
I'm
great.
sorry,
Well,
she was what, Angela?
my great grandmother's second husband, and I'm blanking on his name right now, was the brother of the Milner. So this would have been 1920s.
okay.
Winford
That's
Blakesley?
Nope,
He
that's not the
owned-
right
he-
name.
He owned a mill from 1918 to 1952.
Not the owner, the people who actually did the work.
Well, we definitely want to be talking to you and see if we can get that story in whatever detail. So we will be in touch. Okay. We'll
Thank
let
you
you
very
go.
much.
You
Stay
were
well.
planning to leave. We'll let you go, but we'll be in touch. Hope to see you.
Absolutely.
If you
Take
want to
care.
come by, on Saturday, we'll all be around for the opening day, and we'd love to meet in
What are
person.
the hours?
It's 10 to 3.
10 to 3. Great. I need to pick up some more flowers, so I'll be by.
We'll have it for you.
Thanks so much. Stay well, all. Bye-bye.
Very good. Good night.
Good night.
Okay, well, hello, Hal, Carol, Connie, John, Ellen. I just wonder if anybody had any thoughts about how we might use the material that Tony presented in our interpretation. I realize I said this I think last week also, that there's just so much to process and think about. And of course, in this case, it's hints and allusions and possibilities rather than fully documented kinds of material. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
We
Well,
definitely
my
need to
thought
have
is
him
with his
participate next
Tony's
year.
information and information that we may be getting from Cloverfield Preservation Foundation, we may be able to do some kind of plaque up in the mill talking about people who may have been slaves there.
Yeah.
I don't
Connie?
know how everybody else feels about it, but want a new panel about it.
Connie, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, Tony definitely needs to be in our next series of speakers. He's got so much information. And
You're
so
so
many.
good.
He was a great teaser for all his other subjects. I could listen to him all evening long.
Yeah, he's a great speaker. What I was going to say is that what I see here is the opportunity to partner with some kind of academic institution. To put Tony together with Sherry Marsh Johns and I think a professor who's teaching the history of slavery. And what I would love to do is to get some free labor, free meaning graduate students in history who are earning a degree, maybe even undergraduates at Washington College, for example, or
So that makes sense because it's still another form of slavery.
Well, but it's voluntary slavery. They go into it. Not only are they voluntary, they are paying for it. But there is so much detailed research that should be done that I think a coalition of some sort of Tony and Sherry Johns and some students to research each of these individuals, each of the Millers, Cloverfield, the Hopkins Cemetery, the Miller's house. There's so much there that I see it as a research project that should be done before we start, but certainly before we start putting things in writing or on a panel. But we can now say, that totally legitimately that we are beginning this study. We can say that, you know, scholars are beginning to look at Samuel Hopkins and Thomas Hopkins, these two, were they mill owners or millers? I'm not really clear about how that was, but that we are beginning to research them. And there are hints that free Blacks, enslaved people, and white employees were working together, at least at some period, meaning I'm looking at my notes from what Tony said it was happening in 1850 in the census with Samuel Hopkins. And I think that you know, that's the truth. We don't know for sure, but we have interesting hints and we've begun the research.
Barry, I don't want anybody here to think that I was suggesting taking his information and go run down the mill and create a panel. My thing
I
was,
understand.
like I said to Tony, I would seek out Jim Barton, who's the overseer of the project at Cloverfields, and get them two together if Jim agrees, and come up with something in reference to the slaves up at Cloverfields and what he has found out and what Sherry Marsh has found out, and maybe from that information create a panel if it's appropriate for the mill. So
Yeah.
don't want anybody to think that we're just going to grab some papers and tomorrow have a panel, because that is
No.
not correct.
I didn't mean to. I didn't mean
know
to
there's
characterize that as right away.
A letter from William Hemsley to Tillman, who was traveling during a severe rainstorm to Philadelphia. Hemsley told Tillman that he had to have 20 people go down to the mill to shore it up because of flooding.
Mm.
And two other mills in the area, one of them is Seth Mills, I forget what the other one was completely destroyed by these heavy rains. And he also told Tillman that he had 30 people go down the mill after the storm and have it cleaned up. And in my mind, they were probably what else but slaves. So that's what I found interesting.
They weren't board members?
Say again? What'd you say, Carol?
Are you sure they weren't board members?
They could be.
John,
What
if
are you doing Saturday?
John, if you do approach Jim Barton, please don't use the term overseer.
Okay.
Can I ask one question, just because you mentioned her name a couple of times? Who is Miss Marsh?
Sherry Marsh Johns was the second speaker in the series. And so she is a historian and preservationist who is on the staff of the group that is restoring Cloverfield.
Okay, great.
So
He
we
was
found
hired by
her
the
through,
Cloverfield Preservation Society to do architectural, historical work for the society.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to connect those two.
She has a place in Annapolis. Her company is in Annapolis, I think.
so I didn't mean to imply that you were saying we should put up a panel tomorrow with the little bit of information, that the pieces of information that we can pull together. But I just want to emphasize the kind of the long-term nature of the activity that we need to do, that we need to be, I would recommend that we look at it over a long-term sense and try to plot out together with Sherry and Tony how to encourage and support that kind of research, so that eventually we can feel like we really have a complete understanding of what this situation might have been. Very exciting. I think there's a lot of potential there.
Or if Tony could just invite Oprah to the mill, that'd really help us.
Yeah,
Oh, you're right.
right.
Well, there's in our contemporary culture, any kind of celebrity connection can be very powerful. So if not
That's
Oprah,
why we
maybe
have Connie on our
Oh,
list.
that's right. The Greek celebrities. Well, Barry, thank you very
Yeah.
much for putting this.
Very
together.
good.
This is really spectacular.
Yeah.
see you all on Saturday.
All right. Hal, did you want to say anything?
No, it's very informative. I am gonna come by on Saturday, but can't stay too long. Is there a time that I should show up? Maybe you don't have somebody else covering something?
5 a.m.
It's gonna be cold.
We're asking our volunteers to be there by 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. Okay. My daughter's gonna be bringing me by, so she'll keep me from staying too long, unfortunately.
I'll be right there.
Okay.
Okay.
9 o'clock. All right.
Maybe next time we'll find out who the mysterious NIA is.
Still logged on. So,
Yeah.
well, very good. I'll dress.
Good
along
night,
with-
everybody.
Good
See you
night.
on Saturday.
Thank you. All right. See you.